certainly quite a significant evolution I think we've seen probably in the last 10 years is this convergence of the marketing space and the design space. Yeah. Really everyone is trying to solve the same problem, but coming at it from a very, very different angle.
What was interesting being, in-house is that, and obviously from an industrial design perspective, because that's kind of where I've been historically, but you need to know how things go together. But interestingly, from an organizational perspective, the design function actually often has a true 360 view.
Luke, so lovely to have you.
Cheers, Ben.
So first we're going to start talking about, I guess, past, present and future, your time in creative industries, how you've seen it evolve over the years, where we are right now and where you think we're going in the future.
Right. Yeah, so I suppose for me, and as we've spoken about in the past, because I've spent some time in-house, I had a view of how agencies were operating, but also the role of brand, I suppose, in terms of pulling those things together. So I'd say sort of historically, it's felt a bit to me as though you've had these kind of exceptional specialists. So you might have people in spatial or, for example, in product or service, and they do a great job. And actually, in that particular space, it was the job of the organisation or the brand to try and pull those things together in a meaningful way. And I think that model still remains, but I think there's a growing need for those disciplines to be structured in a certain way. So we talk a lot about, how do you architect an experience? And actually, you can say, for example, within any experience, you could call this a singularity. It's a cup in a space, but then of course you've got the space, you've got the people, you've got the lighting. So all of these things come together to give that context. So I think what I've seen is, and it's nothing new particularly, but it's definitely a sense that orchestrating some of these specialisms into one story seems to be the thing that's more emergent now, more than ever, and more necessary for brands to really, sit in the right space and be competitive.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I mean, I've certainly experienced the same. I think there's certainly always been a need and always will be a need for expert craftspeople. Yeah. Ultimately, really, clients are more and more buying the combination of craftspeople. How can you bring together these brand ecosystems that feel different and emotionally sit with their customers in a different way than certainly their competitors do?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's what's becoming more and more evident is the brands that we know and love need to work harder to really harness all of these elements and push them into a direction that is, as we would talk about, kind of synonymous with them as an organisation. So I think the role of this specialist craft, these very specialist disciplines and studios and practitioners is still relevant, but it's how those are wielded within a story, which I think is really fascinating. Something that we have tried to kind of leverage as much as possible here in a studio.
Yeah, and it's ultimately about how do you build that very coherent experience that feels different. If you can make it feel different, you're kind of winning. Yeah. And I think we're hearing that more and more and more nowadays. Yeah. The other angle, that's certainly quite a significant evolution I think we've seen probably in the last 10 years is this convergence of the marketing space and the design space. Yeah. Really everyone is trying to solve the same problem, but coming at it from a very, very different angle. The marketeers understand how to tell stories, they understand how to sell ultimately, and the designers understand how things fit together, how you actually build something. Yeah. But this beautiful convergence of the two ideas in the middle in this brand experience realm,
exactly that.
I think is starting to gain a lot more traction certainly than it did 10 years ago.
Yeah, and I'd say to that point, every interaction, everything that a brand generates is a communication. And so the brand experience space, I think, has suddenly it's opened up to, you can see businesses trying to pivot into it.
Yeah.
Because of course it sort of demonstrates brand, ethos, philosophy, and identity in one seamless, experiential journey. So yeah, you're right, and it's almost, it is the you could well see that people who've been more dedicated to communication are going to start to try and sort of migrate slightly towards brand experience, and those that have been dealing with, as you say, building, fundamental product and service, might also start to move towards there, because that's a sort of feels like a growing realm.
Yeah, and I suppose on the expertise point, there's experts in all of those realms, but really the beauty we're talking about is how you bring those things together, and how do you make those people work together and operate effectively so that they understand each other's worlds enough to be seamless, but ultimately they still have this backbone, this spine of expertise and execution that's kind of next level.
Yeah.
And I think that, go on.
Sorry. No, I was just going to say, I think that what was interesting being, in-house is and obviously from an industrial design perspective, because that's kind of where I've been historically, but you need to know how things go together. But interestingly, from an organizational perspective, the design function actually often has the true 360 view, because you're dealing with people, product, infrastructure. So actually it's a very powerful space to occupy.
Yeah.
But I do think, whilst, we've talked about this kind of polymathic mindset, people who are curious and are able to move across, different disciplines to whatever extent, but you still need to have an underpinning of fundamentally how things work.
Yeah.
Whether that's a physical object or an interaction from a service perspective, or how food is delivered to an aircraft onto a plate, there are fundamentals around that. You still need to have that. So I think there's a layering that takes place from true expertise into this slightly more, terrible term, but post-disciplinary mindset.
I mean, it brings us nicely on to the recent conversations we've been having with lecturers at a number of universities in the UK around this there's a lot of unknowns at the moment about the skill set shifts needed amongst designers.
Yeah.
And obviously AI is going to come up in this conversation, but how are people and how are universities addressing this skill set evolution? The market is moving. How are we, I guess, setting our undergrads up for success in the working world? Do you have a point of view on that?
I actually would say that, we have a great educational system in the creative space, but I would say that it probably needs looking at more closely now. I don't know if enough is. Some are doing it well in terms of moving students into a slightly broader space. There's always a danger that you go too broad without the underpinning.
Yeah.
So I think there's more that can be done to actually give people the skills to understand, as I said, how things work, but then to elevate them into a space around brand in its kind of truest sense, not necessarily in terms of, the traditional view of identity and mark making in that respect, but actually brand in terms of the thread that naturally connects an experience and should be layered amongst everything.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that's necessarily being addressed in quite the way it could be.
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, I think we found, certainly with hires that we make here, we've always expected and wanted a deep skill set in something.
Yeah.
But ultimately, over the course of their time at university and into the grad era, they've already begun to look sideways and go, right, I fundamentally understand, I am an industrial designer, I understand that piece of the puzzle so deeply, but really I understand design more holistically, and I'm starting to lean into other things like storytelling or graphic design, or some are starting to execute AI tools really effectively. So it's not about, well, we certainly don't think it's about teaching polymathic skills at university, it's about
horizon opening.
It's about having people that are willing to open their eyes up to a broader skill set.
Yeah, and I would say one thing that I would say probably most, let's say, industrial designers or designers in general would attest to is there is a great attraction to designing something and saying you've produced it and then seeing it out in the world, authoring objects or whatever it might be. And I think that is one of the things that sometimes, in some ways, it has a center of gravity around it that sometimes doesn't allow people to move past that sense of authorship. So I think what we're trying to do is to give that sense that actually, yes, you might be involved in the delivery of X, and yes, you can say that your hand has been clearly and cleanly sort of part of the delivery of it. But actually, if you can be involved in the authorship of the symphony of the brand experience, that's a really beautiful place to be in, because fundamentally, the system and the architecture that gives rise to these singularities, as I call them, is one of the most powerful pieces, and probably will be the most powerful as AI starts to, as it's doing, take hold.
So, the future gazing moment, and we've been asked this recently a number of times, actually, certainly by our team, but also by clients and others, is what role, and this is this is guesswork and crystal ball gazing a little bit at the moment, but what role do we think the design studio or the creative studio is going to play in 10 years' time?
So I think there's a couple of, and maybe right or wrong, there's a couple of things that are happening. I think one is people are concerned about AI, but I think AI is a tool, and what it might do is actually push creative practices into the space that they should be in, which is enabling brands to get into that 5% layer.
Yeah.
And that we've talked a lot about this echo chamber, as I've called it, which is, there's no doubt that in certain industries, the ability to produce something is becoming easier. So we've talked about, in automotive, electric vehicles, they kind of sound the same, that old dialogue. So for example, how does a creative studio with AI as a tool enable and support a brand to actually do things which are synonymous with it? And actually it's harder work.
Yeah.
But it's kind of what we should be doing anyway.
Yeah.
And I think we've talked about, this idea of, experience being the advantage, and fundamentally AI is the multiplier. So if you can get the experiential advantage, AI, whether it's generative or agentic, is a thing that actually can really accelerate. Yeah, it grows it, but the kind of seed has to be correctly placed, and that origin point, if that's not right, then you're kind of multiplying into nothing. So so I think that's it, and I think it will be. It will be tricky at points. We can see that it's quite astounding the speed of generative AI. How quickly that's evolving and producing really remarkable results. But I think it kind of just makes us work. We have to work harder.
I mean, there is very clearly, we're going to see a market. We think we're going to see a market of the barrier to create relatively homogeneous design is low, and there is a huge market for that, and there's lots of people that will if the priority is elsewhere, then you will be able to design experiences and objects and spaces with the help of these tools very, very quickly and very easy, and the output's often good. But I totally agree with your point. Is the point of the existence of the creative studio changes. It's not about doing the entire thing. It's actually about doing the top slice.
Yeah.
So on that, what if let's future gaze even more, looking 5-10 years from now. If there is one skill that someone in the creative industry, or you'd advise someone in the creative industry to kind of dial up and really focus in on, what would that skill be?
I would say, I think brand will remain. And so understanding really what that means in a contemporary setting is very, very important. How do you decode it? How do you wield it in such a way that it actually is useful to you when you're doing something new? I think this idea of how you want people to feel is maybe a bit of an old position, but I still think it's very, very valid. It actually gives you it helps you to orchestrate and craft things with specificity of how you want that person to feel at that particular moment. And then I think
understanding of the human emotion.
Yeah, human emotion, and actually, what are the things that really are going to improve that? It might be a product, but it might be a conversation. So I think that's like a very, very powerful thing to wield. I was saying to someone the other day that, we were talking about, I think in some cases, physical design has its complications and it's challenging, but if you're designing a conversation, that's challenging. Because you're dealing with people. And of course, I was saying again in this conversation, things like service, it has a form to it. You can be in a restaurant environment, which I've done before, where the movement of people through that space and the conversation is very natural, or they can be tripping up over each other and it feels tense. So actually, some of these things where you put your creative mind and your capability away from what your natural habitat into something else, I think is really valuable. And then I think the last bit is just to really consider things as relationships. Relationships between people, between objects, between environment and objects, between brand. And those relationships, I think, we talk a lot about this inside out approach, is to really to know and to support businesses in how do you deliver the same quality experience that you would give to your customer to the people inside an organization. Because sure as eggs, if they're feeling good about it, then they're going to deliver a better experience. So that whole internal piece, I think, is, this idea, we talk about cultural symmetry. The idea that you have to have the same culture internally as you are delivering externally. So that's probably 4 things.
Right down the line. That was more than I was anticipating. I know we need to break in a minute, but one last point we wanted to talk about is, and I think we touched on this actually throughout, but creative excellence, the idea of creative excellence is kind of in the eye of the beholder to some extent. What is your perception, or how do you perceive and explain the idea of creative excellence to people?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say that creative excellence is probably the ability to deliver exquisite work in whatever realm that might be, but to do it in such a way that in the eyes of the customer, or in the eyes of people who are using that service or product, it could not be done by any other organization than the one that is producing it. So I think creative excellence is a number of things. It's the ability to really understand what your audience wants. And I think as part of that, which we're doing a lot of work in, is, you've been nose coning this, but the idea of actually measuring and getting true metrics around what people want. It's amazing how many times you design with an intuition. Brands do this, design with an intuition that actually the customer wants this, when actually that's not necessarily going to affect loyalty or spend or some of those good things. So I think the combination of the science and measurement and actually really understanding, illuminating that space from a customer perspective, and then actually delivering to it, but doing it in such a way that's like, wow, this could be no one else. This has to be X brand. And I think some of that comes, and we talk a lot about this, is, can you be in a space, and if you removed or be absorbing something and using something, if you remove the brand from it, would you know who it is? I still think that's a nice litmus test.
And I think this is such a strong point around, it goes back to the whole red thread idea we were talking about at the beginning of, it's moments in isolation or elements of a brand designed in isolation will never give real creative excellence. What will is that a customer rebuys, right? Because they have looked at that brand and they've flown on an airline and they've felt different about it. And it's they don't really necessarily know why. And I think actually in a lot of our behavioral science work and our measurement work, we've actually realized often that the combination of certain activities or ideas throughout a journey on a flight, for example, has led to this retinal burn of like a certain experience. They can't quite pinpoint exactly why it was different and why it was interesting, but it's memorable. And the fact is, they don't necessarily, subliminally, they don't necessarily know why they've rebought. That's the impact piece. That's like, I actually changed how they felt about that experience, and therefore they've gone and bought from me.
Yeah, and I think that's to that point. There's a couple of other things as well connected to that. I think one is the idea of, you know, if you're a brand that has lots of different touch points or different geographic locations, for example, you want, you know, we talk a lot, you want continuity, but it's more about familiarity of an experience, not necessarily rigid consistency, because that sometimes removes that human element. So I think that's something that's quite interesting in terms of how do you flex that brand to different landscapes and different moments. And then the other bit I think is interesting is, you know, I think it's been sort of, to some degree, you know, you have, you know, designers doing what they do and then the comms people do what they do. I think the ability, you know, in service, the ability for creative minds to transition and move across from designing something to maybe comms work, that's a very exciting space. You know, I've always felt this, you know, we're very well placed because we design the objects and the infrastructure. We're very well placed to help communicate that.
Tell the story.
Yeah, tell the story. So why not? You know, so I think that's another really interesting space where we can start to flex, you know, and different disciplines can move into different spaces.
I mean, ultimately, as you're designing, you're creating the story. Or you know, the communications piece is the next step. Very, very natural step in that. And as you start then telling that story out in the open, out in the world, externally or even internally to the staff, to galvanize teams around, I guess, pure transformation.
Totally right. And it's going to be a learning curve, but I think it's a natural, because of this brand experience notion, it's a natural moment for some of those boundaries to start to dissolve slightly between, you know, what's happened in the past and where we are now.
Agreed. So on that note, I think we've cracked it. We've cracked it all.
Nice to chat.
Good to chat. Yeah. Thank you, Luke.
Cheers, Ben.
Yeah. I think that's probably it, guys.